Democracy That Delivers is brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. Now, to your host.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Democracy That Delivers podcast. I'll be your host today. I'm Jenny Anderson, Senior Program Officer with the Asia Pacific team here at SITE. Today, we'll be discussing Cambodia, the recent commune-level elections, and what these elections can tell us about the state of Cambodian politics. We'll also be discussing Cambodia's foreign policy, the role of China, and the impact of the war in Ukraine in Cambodia. I have the pleasure of being joined today by our guest, Charles Dunst. Charles is an associate at the Asia Group and a fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is a former foreign correspondent. He has reported from countries including Cambodia, also Vietnam and Myanmar, for the New York Times and the Atlantic. He has also written opinion articles for these same outlets, along with others like The Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and CNN. He is regularly quoted in the media by the Financial Times and Bloomberg, and has appeared as a commentator on broadcast outlets like the BBC and ABC News. Charles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Great to be here.
To kick off our conversation, and for our listeners who might not be so well acquainted with Cambodia, can you give us a brief synopsis of how Cambodia got to where it is today? How did it go from a quasi-democracy to a one-party state?
Sure. So thanks for having me off the bat. And I will say with Cambodia, the story really starts in the early 1990s, if you want to kind of begin there. After around a decade of Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia, Vietnam had ousted the Khmer Rouge and was essentially controlling Cambodia, was running a puppet government. And in the early 1990s, the United Nations came in kind of with Vietnam's tacit acceptance, with the goal of essentially democratizing Cambodia, making Cambodia an independent state. And that culminated after $2 billion spent on this effort, culminated in the 1993 UN-run elections. And the result of those elections was Hun Sen, who had been the Vietnamese appointed prime minister, actually lost, came in third, but managed through engineering a secession crisis, basically managed to strong arm his way into a power sharing agreement with the prince at the time. And basically, I would argue that the current state of Cambodia and Cambodian politics and the Cambodia-China relationship really stems from 1997, which was the year in which Hun Sen ousted his co-prime minister in a violent coup in Phnom Penh. And at that moment, he really lost any remaining goodwill from the West. The Western countries pulled much of their aid out of Cambodia, whereas China stayed based on the non-interference policy and saying we don't really care about countries' internal affairs as long as willing to work with us on an international level. So that is kind of where the decline of what was a nascent quasi-democracy in the first place really starts. So from 1997 on until about 2017, there was relative competition in Cambodian elections. I don't think Hun Sen's Cambodian People's Party, the CPP, ever allowed for free and fair elections in a way that might have actually seen them lose power. But they did face meaningful challenges, particularly in 2013 and 2017, from what was known as the Cambodian National Rescue Party, the CNRP. And after a particularly strong performance by the CNRP in 2017. I think they got around 44% of the vote, and prompting protests in Phnom Penh with folks basically alleging that the election was stolen, that the CNRP actually did better than 44%, that they probably won. It's really, we still don't know exactly what happened there, but the Cambodian government, the Supreme Court, which is very much party affiliated with the CPP, responded by banning the CNRP in 2017. And ever since then, Cambodia's really lost any type of democratic veneer it might have had. There has not been a reasonably competitive election since. I mean, the 2018 election, the CPP ran unopposed and won all 125 National Assembly seats and all the open Senate seats, and prompted headlines like "Democracy has died in Cambodia" or "Cambodia is the world's newest one-party state." So that's basically setting the stage for the recent commune elections and explaining how we got to a place where the CPP really runs the whole system relatively unopposed, or no, almost entirely unopposed, despite having faced relative political contestation for the better part of 2 decades.
Thanks, Charles. That was an excellent overview. And speaking of the commune elections, is there anything, the elections that happened on June 5th at the commune level, what can these tell us about Cambodian politics? And what does this say? There will be 2023 national elections. Like, what can we learn from the 2022 elections that just happened? What are some indicators to look for?
Sure. So, as expected in the June 5th election, the CPP claimed a decisive victory. Somewhere around 73% of the popular vote claimed all but four of the around 1,600 commune chief races. So, basically, to explain in kind of non Cambodian terms, the commune chief is basically a pretty powerful local level job in something kind of like the equivalent of a mayor in a little bit of one way or another. And then, so the CPP claimed all but four of those around 1,600 races, and as well as 80% of those for commune councillor, which is a slightly lesser position. So basically, you have the CPP kind of galloping to a very clear, decisive victory, even though the elections were kind of expectedly marked by reports of voter intimidation and irregularities. Notably, though, you have this new-ish party called the Candlelight Party that emerged from the CNRP's embers, essentially. It's a lot of former CNRP members who have basically come together with the goal of basically refashioning Cambodia's position. And they had some moderate success. I mean, they did win around 18% of the commune councillor elections. They did win the four commune chief positions that the CPP did not. But voter turnout was down. It was the worst in several election cycles, hovering around 77%. And you have reports of people basically saying voters were not excited for this election because the results were known as they've been since 2017. I mean, at least in 2017, someone who preferred the opposition could go out and vote and say, okay, well, I may understand in my heart of hearts that the CPP is not going to let the CNRP take the prime ministership, but they may give us more seats in the National Assembly. We might be able to actually make reforms, but that has just about entirely dissipated. And what's notable to me is the fact that the CPP seems to have allowed the Candlelight Party to win such a meager amount of seats reflects to me some concern in Phnom Penh on two ends. I mean, first, I would say the CPP is aware that another Potemkin election in which the CPP wins every seat is just unwise from a public relations perspective. If your goal is to somewhat improve ties with Europe or with the United States, which Cambodia kind of needs to for economic reasons, you don't want to be known as a one-party state. You don't want headlines in the Washington Post or in the European papers declaring that you're a one-party dictatorship. So allowing the Candlelight Party to win some seats is clearly designed to counteract that criticism. But the fact that the CPP allowed them to win such a small number of seats seems to reflect some concern in Phnom Penh. It seems like Hun Sen is really scarred by 2013 and 2017 when the CNRP did nearly best his party. And if the elections were free and fair, the CNRP very well may have bested the CPP. So it seems like Hun Sen is quite concerned about allowing even a limited amount of contestation or giving the CP a meaningful number of seats, essentially fearing a repeat of 2013 or 2017 or worse. That being said, I think the Candlelight Party's ability to field candidates across just about the whole country is not unimportant ahead of next year's general elections. It shows to me that there is still an appetite for opposition, at least in some corners of Cambodia, even if we don't exactly know if in a free and fair election who would triumph. I mean, the CPP has always done better in these localized elections than on the national scale. So it's very well plausible that in a free and fair election, the CPP could still actually win at the commune level. But moving into the general elections, the Candlelight Party's ability to kind of have a real national presence and to kind of be somewhat back on the scene is notable. That being said, those elections will not be truly competitive. It's just about impossible to imagine Hun Sen allowing for free and fair elections in 2023. You've already seen, I think, today, the Cambodian government in Phnom Penh arrested somewhere around 38, I believe, opposition candidates, pretty trumped up political charges. So it matters. The Candlelight Party's performance matters in that it helps demonstrate, to me at least, that there is still an appetite for opposition. But we should not get our hopes up of a Candlelight Party victory in 2023 or anything like that.
Yeah, in the 2023 elections, I mean, Hun Sen's son, Hun Manet, has already announced his candidacy for prime ministership, possibly seeing the extension of the Hun dynasty at this phase. Given everything that you just explained, are there some things, indicators that we should look for regarding the run up to the elections? I mean, you mentioned that, the CPP only really allowed 4 seats to be won. What should we look for maybe in the coming year about maybe a worsening of the political space or a bettering? What are some indicators we might be on the outlook for?
Sure. A big thing on my end is to watch. I would say, I mean, it's hard because not everyone speaks Khmer. I don't speak great Khmer. Not everyone can read Cambodian news sources. But following along with kind of reports of intimidation or arrests of opposition figures at the local level is really important. In many ways, the Cambodian government understands that Phnom Penh is something of a mirage. In this country of 60 million, 80% or so are subsistence farmers. So they understand that Phnom Penh, which feels in many ways like an open city, there are many Western diplomats, Western aid workers, Western journalists. It's many folks' image of the country, and it's not necessarily a representative one. So the Cambodian government, to my mind, generally has in recent years somewhat shied away from being too aggressive on cracking down in Phnom Penh, but has instead been more aggressive in the countryside. And I think that's something to watch. If the limited number of opposition figures that have managed to actually win seats are facing pressure or are otherwise ousted or facing intimidation ahead of the elections, that would indicate to me a worsening of the climate ahead of 2023. But given that Cambodia is still the ASEAN chair and is still benefiting from being the ASEAN chair in terms of hosting the East Asia Summit in the fall, which Joe Biden seems likely to attend. I mean, you're the chair of ASEAN, you're getting the US president in your country is a big deal. And I think the government understands, the Cambodian government for that matter, understands not to crack down so aggressively that you do something so kind of just obvious that frustrates the Americans and keeps Joe Biden away. So I would expect if there is more repression, it will be in the countryside rather than in Phnom Penh. And I think one important point to make about Hun Manet, his son, Hun Sen's eldest son, is one, there's already some internal pushback from CPP elites who want power for themselves or they think they want power for their sons. So this was a whole thing in late December where after Hun Sen publicly for not the first time, but very aggressively said, Hun Manet, that's my choice for successor. There was pushback from internal CPP members, and Hun Sen essentially softened it and walked it back and said, well, we should have open contestation between the sons of my other top cadres. And there's basically saying the defense minister's son, along with Hun Manet, should run. And it's not in 2023, in theory. It's in maybe 2027, further down the line. Yeah, Hun Sen has made it very clear that he's not going anywhere anytime soon. I think that's in part because it does not seem like a particularly seamless transition for a variety of reasons that we can get into. But, father to son authoritarian successions they don't have a great track record of working over the last 100 years, with the exception of Syria and North Korea. But they generally are hard to accomplish, and owing to endemic rivalries within the ruling party, owing to the fact that the sons are rarely as charismatic as their fathers, which is certainly the case here. And, they don't have the same experience managing these rivalries within the party. So it is something to watch in terms of Hun Manet basically being anointed and elevated. But whenever that moment comes, that moment of transition, if Hun Sen is out of the picture, whether that means he's passed away or if he's otherwise kind of ill and can't exercise his influence, I would cast doubt on the idea that it will be a seamless transition. I think Hun Manet will face backlash, but that's a separate issue, I guess.
Thanks. Yeah, so much to keep an eye out for. Thanks, Charles. Switching gears a bit, you've mentioned China, the US, ASEAN. Thinking about Cambodia's foreign policy, and maybe starting with China, Cambodia's relationship with China makes a lot of news in the West. Can you explain a bit on what's going on here?
Sure. So, as I said before, the current state of China-Cambodia relations really did start in 1997 when Hun Sen kind of came to understand the West, or came to believe, the West is not my friend, the West will be critical of my approach to governance. Because Hun Sen essentially believes after the Khmer Rouge period, after the Vietnam period, after the UN period, that him being the authoritarian in control is the best way to bring stability and peace to Cambodia. That's his belief. That's a message he takes to local provinces all the time around election time, but otherwise, and basically says, have you been in war in the last 30 years? And the answer is no. Well, maybe not in the last 30 years, but the answer is generally no. And that is one reason he has such legitimacy. He still does have a fair amount of legitimacy from Cambodians, particularly older Cambodians. And so when he in 1997 took power in a coup, I think that was in the back of his mind, saying, me being in power will be better for stability and peace. Democracy is messy. Democracy leads to protests and conflict, where just me being in power will keep everything simple. And obviously, for a million reasons, the United States, the West, Japan to some extent did not agree for the reason of A, we prefer democracy, and B, we spent $2 billion to foster democracy in Cambodia, and it didn't work. But China kind of emerged as a partner, pretty much willing to just look away on the human rights stuff and on the decline of democracy. So in the years since, the China-Cambodia relationship has deepened in virtually every aspect. I mean, to the point that Hun Sen has, deported Uyghurs back to China. He's banned the Taiwanese flag from being flown in Cambodia. Pretty kind of aggressive, at least at home. When Cambodia last chaired ASEAN in 2012, they basically took ASEAN operates on unanimity. So the bloc has to agree to kind of do anything. They all have to agree, all 10 members. And Cambodia blocked ASEAN from releasing a statement critical of China's policies in the South China Sea. And that was 10 years ago. And they've done it again since. And China has emerged as basically Cambodia's number one partner across just about every aspect. I mean, the United States is still Cambodia's largest market for exported manufactured goods. But China provides huge amounts of development aid, political kind of backing for Hun Sen. And in many ways, that has manifested itself as kind of seen through Western media. It's manifested itself in military and security ways that are increasingly concerning the United States, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, with this notion of a potential Chinese kind of military facility at the Riam naval base in the Gulf of Thailand, off the coast of Cambodia. And it's really kind of somewhat still unclear what's happening there, but the U.S. officials are pretty blunt, saying this will be a Chinese naval facility in one way or another, and the Cambodians are going to ridiculous efforts to hide that from us. And there was a groundbreaking ceremony last week, I will say, notably the groundbreaking ceremony at which the Chinese ambassador to Cambodia attended, along with Cambodia's defense minister, was basically saying China's funding construction on this base. That was technically for the Cambodian part of the base, not for what may be used by the Chinese. But either way, it does seem more likely than not that this tight-knit China-Cambodia relationship will manifest itself in China using this base in the Gulf of Thailand for one military purpose or another. It's a small area. It's under, I want to say it's 0.1 square miles. I mean, it's really quite small. So it does not seem likely to me that China is going to be, landing military airplanes there or anything. But in any type of conflict scenario in the Malacca Straits and the Taiwan Strait, it could be a pretty key refueling and resupply area. So that would be one thing to watch for. And secondarily, it's gotten a little bit of press, but not in recent years. In Darusakor, which is this nearby province in Cambodia, there is a pretty unknown Chinese group. It's a company that is state, if not affiliated, kind of state linked, that has an 100-year lease on this big plot of land they say is for a resort, but it's in the middle of nowhere. It's not exactly a prime resort area. And there is construction that does show that there is being built basically an airport-like facility that could actually enable for Chinese aircraft. So I would just be wary of that. And I imagine U.S. officials at the DoD and state certainly are aware of that. So that's kind of where we've gotten, where basically China, by just maintaining personal ties with Hun Sen, by literally rolling out the red carpet when he comes to Beijing, by giving him vast sums of money, both for development and to help his patronage, kind of help him stay in power by maintaining his patronage scheme, has resulted in making Cambodia a relatively pliant partner at this point.
I mean, it feels like Cambodia is trying to balance a bit. Like there is some, I mean, there are some public statements saying that, oh no, we're not. Some, I don't know, that they're trying to pedal back their relationship with China a bit. What is Cambodia's outlook on the U.S.? Like, does it want a relationship with Washington? What's its foreign policy outlook on the U.S.?
Sure. It seems to me like there are certain elites in the Cambodian government, whether or not that's Hun Sen himself or not, who have come to kind of understand that being this aligned with one great power is not particularly wise. Whereas someone like Thailand or the Philippines or most Southeast Asian countries, frankly, have managed to play the United States and China off one another and extract more and more benefits from both. So there is a clear practical reason for doing this. Of if you make them compete for influence, they'll give you more money. And that's kind of a clear point, just practically speaking. But additionally, there's a little bit of a public relations issue for Hun Sen's government in that in Cambodia, the United States remains far more popular than China among average people. That's owing to a variety of issues stemming from just classic American soft power in terms of culture, whether that's media or whether it's music, movies, whatever. There is a lot of American soft power that is present despite the wartime history and all that. And secondarily, the physical presence of Chinese goods and Chinese expats in Cambodia has reverberated somewhat poorly across the country, where I'm not sure if listeners are not familiar, they might want to Google. Sihanoukville is this city in Cambodia on the Gulf of Thailand that has in recent years essentially just become a Chinese enclave. And I was there in 2018, and it's staggering. I mean, it's half-built buildings that everything's in Chinese language. Everything became more expensive, and the Cambodians are priced out. And it's not, and I think we overstate sometimes how much control China has in terms of the Belt and Road and all that. But basically, the folks who are working in Cambodia, in countries like Cambodia from China, tend in many places to be people who would otherwise be unemployed in China. So China is in one way or another kind of exporting its overcapacity to developing countries, which has the result of kind of bringing along Chinese gangs and organized crime with it, which has predictably worsened Cambodian public opinion of China. And you see media reports on Cambodian social media all the time of ex-Chinese crime in Phnom Penh, ex-Chinese crime in Sihanoukville. And it's not that, the Western expats don't also commit crimes. Of course they do. But it's the way the media, Cambodian media, has focused on the kind of Chinese misdeeds has actually had a real negative impact on Cambodian views of China. So accordingly, Hun Sen understands that there is a need to make it look like his government has some Western approbation and particularly American approbation. So I can tell a quick story that is a little silly that indicates this, where essentially a few years ago, the Cambodian government hired a lobbyist who was also a state senator in the state of Washington. It's a part-time job, so you're allowed to also be a lobbyist, which is kind of confusing to me, but anyway, totally legal. Invited him to Cambodia and gave him essentially a state visit. He monitored 2018 elections. And then in Cambodian media, both in local and Khmer language and in English language, referred to him as Washington Senator. Because when you refer to them as a Washington Senator, people think that is a national U.S. Senator, one of the important U.S. senators. And it seemed like a U.S. Senator, someone like Joe Biden was just a few years ago, or I guess longer than that, but was giving Cambodia approval, was approving the Hun Sen government, was approving the election procedures. And that's really important. That's really, really important for the Cambodian government, which is one of the reasons why Hun Sen pushed personally for the recent US-ASEAN summit. When other ASEAN members were, could take it or leave it. If the United States wants to host us, sure, we'll come. But Hun Sen personally really, really wanted that White House visit that he'd long been denied. So it's both practical of if we better balance the United States and China, we can get more money from both of them. And secondarily, he just wants to make it look like he has more American support because it will help his popularity at home, which you've already seen manifest a little bit in that there's a new ambassador in town in DC who is pushing for better ties. But there does seem to be somewhat limited interest in Washington, both because, one, there's a pretty limited practical benefit for the United States of better engaging Cambodia at this point. And secondarily, there's just about no support in the U.S. Congress, which has for years been pretty aggressive on Cambodian human rights issues, on Cambodian governance issues. And if the Biden administration was tomorrow to say we want to deepen ties with Cambodia, they'd get a lot of pushback from the House and the Senate. So there might be a Cambodian yearning, but it's hard. It's not yet clear if there's the similar kind of interest from Washington.
Yeah, and just to, again, sort of change topics a little bit, but it's something that you've written on. And I mean, the world is watching now, the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. You've written on this, you've written looking at the impact of the war in Ukraine on Cambodia. I was wondering, could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. I mean, obviously, since Russia invaded Ukraine, you've had Western-led sanctions along with Asian partners like Japan, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. But of course, India has not joined. Vietnam, one of the U.S.'s most important partners in Southeast Asia, has refused as well, even abstaining from UN votes critical of Russia. Most countries in the region have tried to remain neutral, and one might expect Cambodia to do the same, or at least remain neutral, just given Phnom Penh's own historical ties to Moscow, and of course Hun Sen's aversion to criticizing other leaders' human rights records. But Hun Sen has been really aggressive criticizing Russia. In early March, Cambodia voted in favor of a UN General Assembly resolution condemning the invasion. And when Hun Sen met with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida 2 weeks later, they issued a joint statement in which they obliquely criticized Russia's aggression in Ukraine, even though Chinese President Xi Jinping had called Hun Sen 2 days prior and pushed Cambodia to hold a quote-unquote balanced and fair position on Ukraine. So it seems that Hun Sen is generally personally sympathetic to Ukraine. And he said as much. I mean, in mid-March, he basically just said, my country has been attacked. We've been invaded in the past. I understand what that feels like. And so we oppose that, which is kind of a fascinating thing for a leader who is generally seen as so anti-democracy and so aligned with China, which both of which are true. It's just a reminder, I think, of how he has managed to shift the Cambodian position on this in a way that might not actually be somewhat wise. I mean, from his perspective, criticizing Russia so aggressively is probably not wise from a strategic perspective, given that Phnom Penh obviously is increasingly reliant on Beijing, which opposes such condemnation. And Cambodia has benefited from ties with Russia in recent years and since the Vietnam occupation era. So anyway, the Hun Sen's approach is not going to win him friends or win him, approbation from Moscow or Beijing. But it's a reminder, I think, that Cambodian politics in Cambodian governance is not made by consensus, nor by a host of personalities, but by one personality in Hun Sen, and seemingly by him alone. And the Ukraine crisis and Cambodia's response is, to me, a reminder of that.
I have so many more questions to ask you, Charles. I think we're almost out of time. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm hoping we can squeeze one last question in. And I know you have a book coming out, but it relates to our conversation and to SIPE's mission very much. Maybe just broadly speaking and stepping back a bit, what do the West's efforts in Cambodia, until now, all of the history that you've brought us up until this moment, what does this tell us about democracy promotion in Cambodia and elsewhere?
Sure. What it indicates to me is Cambodia was really the first early, really post-Cold War democracy promotion efforts. There was this real idealism and this real zeal with which folks went in as the Soviet Union collapsed and then eventually fully collapsed, basically saying, this is over. The kind of ideological contestation is over. The autocracies that are backed by communism will fall. The folks who have, the leaders who basically said, I am leading the country as a communist, it was very rooted in ideology, that they would just dissipate and become democracies. And of course, that didn't happen in Cambodia for a million of reasons. And Hun Sen has kind of emerged in one way or another as this kind of archetypal autocrat who doesn't have much of an ideology. I mean, this is not someone who is a fierce communist or, a fierce capitalist or anything like that. He kind of just does what's best for Cambodia. And what it shows to me is, in one way or another, as of course, Iraq, Afghanistan, kind of all these foreign interventions, that intervening in a country and trying to impose democracy almost never works. And the argument of my book essentially is that the West and its partners, its democratic partners in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, can better advance democracy by actually better performing at home. The notion being that we need to, again, be a model for non-democracies elsewhere, that we need our social safety nets to improve, or we need to address the human capital deficit, things like that. We need to actually make democracy work better at home. So once again, a leader in Hanoi or or a civil society in person in Kinshasa can think, well, I look at the United States and I want that. I want what Belgium has. I want what Taiwan has, rather than kind of this view now of people look at maybe at least a little bit before COVID. But when people go to Singapore or Shanghai, they think they've seen the future and they want that. Whereas when folks go to New York or travel around the United States, and I'm born and raised in New York City, so I'm empathetic to New York, but there is, I think, a sense of people come to the United States in particular and see infrastructure that is outdated or homeless people on the streets, and it makes people trust democracy much less versus when they go to somewhere like Singapore or some of the Gulf states and see these gorgeous buildings and everything seems clean and the healthcare seems great and all that. So the argument basically is we need to do much better policy at home across a variety of sectors to make democracies just more appealing. Again, this is a long-term project. By fixing our social safety net in the United States, we will not get Vietnam to become a democracy in 2030. But you need to, again, become a model and set the example. And of course, while you're doing that, you can raise human rights issues with your partners. Of course, I don't mean to suggest that we should never talk about human rights with Vietnam or Thailand or anything. But I think key to the equation here and key to kind of combating the rise of autocracy is performing better at home. So that is the short thesis of what is already a somewhat long book. But thank you.
Well, we'll have to wait for your book to come out and read all of it to get the full essence of what you're talking about. Thank you very much, Charles, for joining us today. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you for simplifying and clarifying what is happening. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone who's listening today. Join in. Charles, we'll have to have you back for a follow-up because there's more to discuss.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.